Hello, this is John with Theologians. We are going to be looking at the Mark of the Beast. This is a continuation of the Questions about the Mark of the Beast series. This is part 4. In the previous video, we talked about the beast that rises up out of the sea, the first beast of Revelation chapter 13. It has, the 7 heads, 10 horns, the crowns on its horns, and it's around for 1,260 days. And the question was, well, what are these 1,260 days, and when do they happen? Now, it's a little bit of a strange question to say what are days? What are the 1,260 days? It seems like the answer is days, right? And sure, that makes sense, and that's the obvious sort of the prima facie answer, right? It's days, but the interesting thing is we have reason to believe from the book of Daniel, for example, and Ezekiel, that in biblical prophecy, at least sometimes, very often, in fact, days represent prophetically years and have an application to years. And the question is, do we have a reason to believe that these 1,260 days can represent years? And if they do, is it possible that there's a dual application, so that there's an application for a 1,260 year period, and then maybe subsequently, following it, a literal 1,260 day period or 3.5 year period, something like what you would expect from the second half of the tribulation that people have talked about. And so we're going to look at what the best explanation of the biblical data is in relation to these 1,260 days. What are they? Are they literal days, 24-hour periods? Are they prophetic days, like in Daniel's 70 weeks, as I'll show in a little bit, where a day represents a year? Is there an application as a year and a day? And when do they begin, whatever they are? If it's years, what year did it begin? If it's literal days, when does that begin? Can we know when it begins, when it ends, and these sorts of things? Okay. Along the way, we're going to be answering a lot of important questions that are going to be important, not just sort of as a method of decoding or digging into and finding hidden things in the book of Revelation, but in understanding our Christian faith. We're going to be, of course, looking at the book of Revelation, Daniel. We're going to look at the 2 witnesses. We're going to talk about their importance and what's going on in that passage when they die. They're dead for 3.5 days on the streets, and then they rise again. We're going to be looking at also the relationship between the church and church history and the life of Christ. And, biblically, Christ is the head of the church, and, we're supposed to be blessed in partaking in the sufferings of Christ and partaking in the life of Christ. And this union is a vital living union. And what's interesting, I'll show in this video, is that the history of redemption, the history of the Christian church, as it's laid out in biblical prophecy, has a very interesting parallel to the life of Christ. Okay, and so we're going to have in this video a complete discussion, not complete, not every detail, but we're going to have an outline of the history of redemption, the entire outline, biblical outline of the history of Christianity from the time of Christ all the way to the millennium. And we're going to look at that, and then we're going to see that the biblical story about the history of redemption is that it is a story of the church participating in the life of Christ over a period of millennia, whereas Christ did this over a period of a single man's lifetime. So now we're going to, and of course I say a single man's lifetime. Christ is human. He's also divine. So I'm not denying the divinity by talking about his human lifetime. So let's go ahead and dig in. What are these days? Now, remember in the previous video we talked about Revelation 12 and 13, the first part of 13, and we saw that we did have a picture already of the history of redemption, the history of Christianity, where we see the woman, the church, bringing forth Christ, okay? And in bringing forth Christ, we have the dragon, the beast, coming against Christ as soon as he's born. So as soon as the church brings forth Christ, we have an attack on him, and the woman having to flee to the wilderness. And where she is fed for, and we see in the blue squares here, 1,260 or 60 days. Okay, so 1,260 days. And we get this in one quick story from Revelation 12, 1 through 6, and then it's repeated again in the next part, Revelation 12 through 17, where we get some further details about what was going on, and it's almost like we pushed from the ancient Roman Empire more to the fallen Roman Empire showing up, and we're going to see that a little clearer there because we have the dragon being cast out of heaven, and then woe unto the people that inhabit the earth, the inhabitants of the earth and of the sea. Okay, and because in the next chapter we're going to see the beast actually come out of the sea. Okay, he went down to the earth and the sea, and now he's going to come out of the sea in the form of that beast in Revelation 13. But we get here in Revelation 12:14 again. What do we have? And to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place. Again, she's fleeing, where she is nourished for a time, that's a year, and times, that's 2 years, and a half a time, and a half of a year, so 3.5 years again, from the face of the serpent. All right, so we get to 1,260 days again, and then we got it in chapter 13, where we get the beast coming out of the sea. The dragon now has been cast down to the earth and the sea, and now he's going to come out of the sea. The masses of the people, the wicked, are like the troubled sea when they cannot rest. And Revelation 17 says the waters of the peoples and so on. So here, out of this mess of the world that came from the fallen Roman Empire, you had the various nations that rise up in the post-Roman world. And that's why the crowns have moved from the 7 heads to the 10 horns, which are kingdoms. So the various kingdoms now have the authority. It's divided up. It's no longer in Rome. It's spread out across the kingdoms. And in this new beast system, the post-Roman Empire, what do we have? Is this 1,260-day period. And there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue 42 months. So 42 months. Again, that's 3 years, 36 months, plus a half a year, 6 months, 42 months. And, lunar calendar, 30-day months. That's your 1,260 days again. So we got it repeatedly. And the question was, of course, what's going on here? What are the 1,260 days? When does that begin? When does it end? We want to know these things. And so here we go, and we're going to look at Daniel, because Daniel is a helpful place for us to start. This is where the beasts are discussed the first time. In Daniel chapter 7, we have this is where Daniel received the prophecy of these beasts, and we see him asking about the 4th beast, which is the Roman Empire beast, and what comes after it. Here in Daniel 7:19 and following, let's read this part. Then I would know the truth of the 4th beast, which was diverse from all the others, exceeding dreadful, whose teeth were of iron, and his nails of brass, which devoured, brake in pieces, and stamped the residue with his feet, and of the 10 horns that were in his head, and of the other which came up, and before whom 3 fell, even of that horn that had eyes, and a mouth that spake very great things, whose look was more stout than his fellows. I beheld, and the same horn made war with the saints, and prevailed against them, until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was given to the saints of the Most High, and the time came that the saints possessed the kingdom. Thus he said, the 4th beast shall be the 4th kingdom upon earth, which shall be diverse from all kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, and shall tread it down, and break it in pieces. And the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise, and another shall rise after them, and he shall be diverse from the first, and he shall subdue 3 kings. And he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws. And here we have it. And they shall be given into his hand until a time and times and the dividing of time. So there again we have this first time, the first mention of these 1,260 days. We get it in the form of the time, the year, the times, the 2 years, and the dividing of the time, the half a year, which is the way it was described, one of the ways that the period was mentioned or referred to in Revelation chapter 12. So we have a direct link here between this beast, which is the 7-headed, 10-horned beast of Revelation, and in Daniel, it's the 10-horned beast. Okay, and we have this link between them and the same period of time. What's important to note here is Daniel. We already have as a precedent in Daniel that Daniel uses the day for a year prophetic rule, where a prophetic day in prophetic language in that genre of biblical literature, if you want to call it that, where we have prophecies happening. When the day is referred to, it often refers to a year, and in Daniel we have that explicitly when he discusses in the 70-week period. Okay, and I'll show that in just a moment. Right here, so the 70 weeks. So 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city, to finish the transgression, and to make an end of sins, and to make reconciliation for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again in the wall, even in troublous times. And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself, and the people of the prince shall come, shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. Okay, so here is our 70-week period. Let's look at this. We have 70 weeks, right? And where does it end? So we have 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city to finish the transgression, right? To finish the transgression, to seal up the vision, anoint the most holy. So this verse in 24, Daniel 9:24. Okay, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up the vision of the prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. There's our end point. Next, we go and we see the starting point. From the going forth of the commandment to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. That's in verse 25. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to rebuild and to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince shall be. There's you start to get your dates, your weeks. Okay, so that's the starting point. The starting point is the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem. And then 69 weeks later is the Messiah the Prince. It shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. So 62 plus 7 is 69 weeks. And that gets us to Messiah the Prince. That's verse 26. So there's the big picture. Okay, we have a commandment to restore and build Jerusalem. 69 weeks later, the Messiah, and then we have a week until we get the finishing things up. Now, we'll worry about that last week in a moment. What's important for us to figure out these 70 weeks and to look at what those days represent is to think about the starting point and this Messiah point, because we know the Messiah came, and we also know when the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem was. And so we can do a quick calculation. Now let's go ahead and look. When was this commandment? Okay, this was under Artaxerxes I, the first, and we see it in Ezra in the 7th year of Artaxerxes. This is his decree, when he makes this decree, and that would have been in the year 458 BC, because his reign began in 465, 7 years in is 458. So we can start that at 458 BC. Now, if the days, these 70 weeks, we have 69 weeks from the beginning until the Messiah. If those days were just literal 24-hour days, well, that puts you in about 457 BC, which isn't even close to when Christ came. Okay, so it doesn't work. But what if we use the day for a year principle? We get this in Ezekiel. We see when Ezekiel represents the siege of Jerusalem. He symbolizes that prophetically, laying on his side and so on. God says, I have appointed thee each day for a year, explicitly laying out in this prophetic context a day representing a year. Now, let's adopt that principle and apply it to Daniel's passage. And we take these 69 prophetic weeks to be 483 years, because 69 times 7 is 483. Okay, and so we get these 483 years. And so after the year 458 BC, well, you end up in the time when the Messiah came. Okay, that's when he would have been about 30 years old. Remember, there's no year zero. So, I mean, hope I got the math here right. Let me glance at it again. So 483 years from 458. So 458, 25. Then you add the 1 because there's no year zero. Yeah. Okay, so we've got this period from 458 BC to AD 26. Now, counting years, the days as a years, each day as a year, we end up precisely, historically, when Christ would have begun his ministry. This is when he would have been anointed, right, to be the Messiah in a sense. John the Baptist baptizing him or something, right? So the Spirit comes down upon him and so on. This would have been when he was beginning that ministry. Now, that's remarkable because Daniel wrote this before even the decree of Artaxerxes. So we have a really remarkable prophecy, but to understand it properly, we had to treat the prophetic day in Daniel's prophetic days, as years. And that's important when we go back to our 1,260 days in Revelation, because they're applied to this beast, and they actually are not just new. It's not just a new thing brought up in Revelation. This is referring back to, pretty clearly, a 10-horned beast in Daniel that would be around for 1,260 days, giving trouble to the saints. Appears to have the same reference, okay? Refer to the same thing. And so now, if we were to treat Daniel consistently, we end up with a day for a year principle, and that's 1,260 years. Now, look at historically that this isn't anything new that I'm coming up with. This is a common, widely held view among theologians from diverse backgrounds. Okay, so Luther and Samuel Schmucker, he in his commentary, regarding a time as a prophetic year of 12 months, each including 30 days, we would have 3.5 prophetic years or 42 prophetic months, which, reckoning a year for a day, according to the prophetic key given by Ezekiel the Holy Seer, are equivalent to 1,260 ordinary years. Or here's Isaac Newton. She is nourished by the merchants of the earth 3 times, or years and a half, or 42 months, or 1,260 days. And in these prophecies, days are put for years. So again, here's Newton saying the same thing as Schmucker, the Lutheran, and now we have Presbyterian, David Steele, and you can get a lot of these guys. He has a commentary on the Apocalypse, notes on the Apocalypse. The period of apostasy from God is fixed to 40 months, according to the Jewish mode of reckoning, a day for a year. The whole period is 1,260 years. Congregationalist Jonathan Edwards, former President of Princeton at the time, the 1,260 days or years are often in Scripture mentioned as the time of the continuance of Antichrist's reign. Baptist John Gill, 42 months, must be understood prophetically of so many months of years, and a month with the Chaldeans consisting of 30 days, and a year of 360 days, which account Daniel used, and John after him, 42 months, reckoning a day for a year, after the prophetic style makes 1,260 years, which is the exact time of the witnesses prophesying in sackcloth, and so on. Okay, so we get it again. This is nothing shocking or new. This is historical Protestant interpretation, not totally universal, but very widespread. And as we've already seen, the case for it's actually exegetically compelling. There's a very good reason. There are very good reasons to believe that the most consistent interpretation of Daniel's days in prophetic literature, in the prophetic writings of Daniel, are referring to years. Okay, it only works with Daniel in the 70 weeks if a day is a year, and doing the same thing with the 1,260 days is a consistent practice. It's just saying, well, Daniel did it already. 2 chapters separated from this first reference of 1,260 years or days. Why would we do it differently here? Now, so when we go back here and look at the Revelation passages in Revelation that talk about this period of time, the most plausible explanation of account of the 1,260 days is that they're referring to years. And so this is a 1,260 year period of time in church history, which is not surprising. Remember when we looked at this outline in the last video, it starts with the crowns on the 7 heads of the beast. And then the crowns shift to the 10 horns. The crowns were on the 7 heads when? When the woman was still bringing forth Christ, when the church is still clarifying who Christ is and is grasping and gaining a better understanding of the Christian faith itself and how to live it out, how to understand the natures and person of Jesus Christ. Okay, so while Christianity was in a sense bringing forth Christ, that was during the Roman Empire and its fall. It's after that the shift of power moves from Rome, the 7 heads representing the 7 hills of Rome, Revelation 17 tells us that, to the kingdoms that come up out of it afterwards, the 10 horns. So we get the crowns shift from the heads to the horns, and then we have this 1,260 day period. Well, that would have started a long time ago. The Roman Empire falls, divides up, and then you get this period with the persecutions and the hostility to true Christianity, and so on. Okay, that's not just. It's not like we went from the Roman Empire and then just have a timeout in these passages for 1,500 years or so, and then all of a sudden we get to the end times, and now the Bible, or now Revelation, has something to say to us. But all those people in the meantime, there was nothing for them there. They were just supposed to hope for what's coming in the future in 1,500 years. That's not to say that they don't have that hope, but the point is that Revelation is actually giving messages there that apply to just about every Christian in history. They could have looked at it and applied it to themselves if they understood where they were at in the history of redemption. Now, we're going to talk about that as well here in a minute. But we have this period of history here that's being referred to. Now, when this begins, this 1,260 year period began. I'll get to that in a moment, and we can become fairly precise, okay? And that's going to be important for our understanding of where we're at now in history, because we're at the end of that 1,260 year period, and that's what's important. Now, for us today, one of the important things, is there a second application? Here's another question. Is there a second application with a final, literal 3.5 years period mentioned? Because I know people are going to look at this and say, well, wait a minute. We know, we've been told our whole lives that there's a 7-year tribulation, and the second half is the bad part. That's the 3.5 years talked about. That's when the beast shows up. That's when we get all that, right? And that's going to be a response, a reaction, and it's a natural reaction. And the question is, what is this? Is what I just said about the 1,260 years incompatible with the belief that there is a especially bad final 3.5 year period? And my own understanding of eschatology is that there is nothing inconsistent in that. There is another 3.5 year period at the end. Okay, now I'll show you that in just a second when we look at Revelation chapter 11 and the 2 witnesses. Now let's go ahead and look at this passage. And there was given me a reed like unto a rod, and the angel stood, saying, Rise and measure the temple of God, and the altar, and them that worship therein. Now remember, the temple in the New Testament is not a physical building. This isn't the Apostle John at the command of this angel going out and measuring a physical temple. This is looking at the church, and that's why it's talking about measure basically the inner court, right? So the temple of God, the altar, and them that worship therein. So we're looking at the worshipers. But the court, which is without the temple, leave out. Don't measure it. So there's a big part of the temple that's the larger part, in a sense, the outer court here. Okay? And it is not to be measured. Why? Because it is given unto the Gentiles. This isn't talking about physical Jews and physical Gentiles. This is talking spiritually. It's talking about the worshipers, the true worshipers. There's your real Christians. And the Gentiles, meaning those who are in the temple of God, in a sense, and the outer court, but they're not worshipers. They're the heathen, the hypocrites, okay, the false believers, the fakes. Okay, what we have is a period of time in the church when there's only a small remnant, a small community of the faithful, and the larger part is outside it. Even though they're in the temple, they're sort of out, and they're not to be measured. They're not the true worshipers. And the holy city shall they tread, who? The larger part of the Christian church. Okay, that's hypocritical. And the holy city shall they tread underfoot for how long? 42 months. There it is again, or 1,260 days. Now we get the 1,260 year period. This is the same period of apostasy when the church has widespread wickedness and hypocrisy and unbelief in it, carnality in it. And when the faithful have to flee, the woman has to go hiding out to keep herself safe. The real worshipers are being protected by God, but the wicked in the church are what? Trampling underfoot, treading underfoot this holy city, the real church, the pure. Now, when we go and we get this description of the 2 witnesses right here, when? And I will give power unto my 2 witnesses, and they shall prophesy for, here it is again, 1,260 days. 1,260 days. This is the same period. Okay? What we're getting is another depiction or representation of this part of history. What is this? What are we saying? We're saying the church, the faithful, being a very few, while the church is filled with hypocrites who are actually the enemies of the faithful. They're treading underfoot the faithful. But they're not killed off. These faithful are here going to be referred to as the 2 witnesses. Remember, 2 witnesses, when we're trying to understand the biblical prophecy here, we're not looking for two people. You're not saying, oh, this is it Moses and Elijah, or Elijah and Enoch, or is it, who could it be? And we're not looking for real two individual people. Two witnesses in the Bible represents what? The minimum number of people necessary to convict another person of a crime, capital crime in particular in the Old Testament, right? If you want to convict somebody of murder, and one witness comes forward and says, I saw it, they can't punish the murderer for that. That's insufficient evidence. It could be a false witness. But if you had but two witnesses, that was enough by the mouth of two or three witnesses. But two witnesses was the minimum. The bare minimum to condemn the guilty was two witnesses. What we're seeing in this passage is these two witnesses, the church being measured as very, very small, while the Gentiles fill it up basically and persecuted, and the small church now gets to be referred to as the two witnesses, the minimum number necessary to convict the Gentiles here of their hypocrisy. And despite the fewness of their number and their in worldly terms, sort of their weakness and feebleness or whatever, they're nothing. Despite this, they're empowered by God. Their influence is significant. They may only be two witnesses, but it's plenty to convict, and it's like they're prophesying against the wicked and bringing down fire and so on out of their mouth. And if any man will hurt them, fire proceedeth out of their mouth and devoureth their enemies. And if any man will hurt them, he must in this manner be killed, and so on. Okay. But this 1,260 year period is a period where they suffer, they go through a hard time, they're being tread underfoot, the church is going to have difficulties, but there's always going to be a remnant, just enough to convict, okay, the guilty. But at the end, something changes, right? So, and when they shall have finished their testimony, their witnesses, that's what they're doing, they're testifying, the beast that ascendeth out of the bottomless pit shall make war against them, and shall overcome them, and kill them. Now listen. And their dead bodies shall lie in the street of the great city, which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt, where also our Lord was crucified, and they of the people and kindreds and tongues and nations shall see their dead bodies for how long? 3 days and a half. And shall not suffer their bodies to be put in the graves, their dead bodies to be put in graves. What's that 3 days and a half? We just had the 1,260 days talked about. We know those represent a year, days a year. So 1,260 days of the church being small and insignificant, the faithful being small and insignificant, but yet powerful and influential and sufficient to condemn all the wicked of their wickedness. Okay? 1,260 years of that. And then at the end, we get something even more extreme. For how long? 3.5 prophetic days or years. There's your 3.5 years of extreme tribulation. You already had 1,260 years of it being hard on Christians and the truly faithful. Very difficult. But they were able to have a voice, a testimony. They are silenced and slaughtered. They're gone, dead and in the streets. Okay, and they don't even let their bodies be buried, in the sense that this isn't going to be just they're gone and forgotten. People are going to be happy they're gone, thinking about it, dancing around, happy that finally we've gotten past this Christian era and gotten rid of these nuisances. Okay, that's the idea. And for how long? 3.5 years. There is your second reference and evidence that we have at the end of the longer period of 1,260 years, a especially bad 3.5 year period, during which time the Christians are persecuted severely and silenced. that is not how it ends, of course. We know that in Revelation, looks like it didn't actually keep it. I didn't actually paste it here, but after this, what happens? They're going to rise from the dead after 3.5 days, and then ascend into heaven, and you're going to have them put into the place of power, and that's what happens in the millennium, right? During the millennium, the church is established as in the place of authority, power, and so on. And so we get this story about the church going through a long period of being very small, very few faithful, only a remnant faithful, 2 witnesses, while the church is generally just filled up with bad people that abuse the power, abuse the authority of the church, that make a mockery of Christ, that are ungodly, blasphemers, hypocrites, and so on. That's the church. They're even persecutors. They're the ones treading underground the church of the holy city, treating it like trash, abusing it all along for 1,260 years. But these 2 witnesses, this remnant, is enough to be a thorn in the side of the wicked and to condemn them. Finally, they're put down at the end in a persecution for 3.5 years. Now, of course, that would suggest if they're being killed off rather than being raptured away, that this passage doesn't give any evidence of a rapture that would happen before the 3.5 years of horrible tribulation, right? The expectation would be that the Christians, the faithful, the 2 witnesses, are going to go through it and suffer unto death in many cases, which isn't that surprising because we're supposed to count it a blessing to participate in the sufferings of Christ, right? Okay, so let's keep going. I'm going to skip ahead a bit. What I was going to say here, there's some interesting questions about the beast, right? We know that the beast in Revelation 13 is the beast out of the sea, the first beast that's there for 1,260 years, making trouble for them. Notice that the beast that comes up and is responsible for killing off the 2 witnesses for the final 3.5 years is referred to as the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit. I think that's referring back to the beast not as just the fallen Roman Empire, but going even back to the source, which would be Satan, the serpent, who was in and behind the Roman Empire, and the beast that comes out of the sea. It's sort of the spirit of it. That's the beast that gives them its power. Satan. Okay, he comes up, and it's like you get a direct attack almost from Satan. Now we get the same reference to the beast ascending out of the bottomless pit in Revelation 17, right? Let's see, Revelation 17, right here. No, where is it at? Look at this. So here, Revelation 17:7. And the angel said unto me, Wherefore didst thou marvel? I will tell thee the mystery of the woman, and of the beast that carrieth her, which hath the 7 heads and the 10 horns. And the beast that thou sawest was and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition. So here we have it coming out of the bottomless pit again. In that context in Revelation 17, we get the 10 horns again. And we have this reference to them receiving power as kings 1 hour with the beast. I'm not sure if that would suggest that at the very end, in this final 3.5 year period, there is your dual application. They might have another application of the 10 horns, being 10 actual rulers who get a very short time, this very, very short time, like an hour with the beast at the very end for this extreme persecution. It's a possibility. Notice that at the end, the Lamb overcomes them. They make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them. But I'm just drawing your attention to that this reference to the beast who is, at the time of the final 3.5 year persecution, is referred to as the beast that comes out of the bottomless pit in Revelation 13, the beast who is persecuting during the 1,260 years, prior to the 3.5 years, is the beast that comes out of the sea. And I don't know if I'm reading too much into that. And I personally don't even know what I think about how to deal with that, except that I do know that the beast that comes out of the bottomless pit is going to have a more specific reference to Satan, right, being the satanic source of all these beast powers. But it seems like there's some special relevance possibly at the very end, because each time we get to the very end, he's referred to as the beast that comes out of the bottomless pit. At least that's one way to look at it. Maybe you guys can help me clarify that in comments. Okay. All right. So I'm going to move ahead. Otherwise, this video is going to last forever. Okay. So now let's go ahead and we're going to look at the history of redemption. Okay. And this is important. And it's going to, you'll see how it all comes together, because what we're going to show is how historically, first off, now we're getting to the question of when this 1,260 years begins. And we're going to see how that actually began almost immediately after, quote unquote, the church brought forth Christ. The woman brings forth the man child who will rule the earth with her, his scepter, his rod of iron, or whatever. Okay, so the idea is we're going to have this history unfold. And remember, it says in Revelation 12. That's going to be a hard slide to find. There it is. Okay, that. And she brought forth a man child, and her child was caught up to God. And the dragon stood before the woman, which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born. Okay, so it's like as soon as the child's born, you get the attack, right? And so we'll be able to see this when we look at the history of redemption. We're going to see how in church history the church brings forth Christ, and then immediately after that we see the rise of the papal Antichrist. Okay, that is the 1,260 year period apostasy, and we're going to see this. It's very fascinating and important if we want to understand our place in history and in the biblical understanding of the history of redemption. So at the beginning we have Christ's ministry. Let's change that. We'll put 30. Okay, so AD 26 to AD 30, roughly. Then we have, from that's the ministry to death and resurrection of Christ. And then we have a period of transition after that, from the year roughly 30 to the year 70, when the temple was destroyed. Now, this period of transition is a period of transition in church history where we move from the Jewish ways of worshiping God to the Christian ways. There is a transition, because you couldn't just, one day you're supposed to be doing your sacrifices, circumcising your kids, and all of that as a Jewish family, and then Christ dies, rises from the dead, ascends to heaven, and then you're supposed to do what? You're no longer faithful. You're in great wickedness, because the next day you still think you're supposed to do that. You haven't learned everything yet. There's going to have to be a period of transition. That period of transition is there's evidence of it in sort of Paul's behavior in the Book of Acts. When he's and in his epistles. When he's writing to Gentile churches, he's telling them, don't get circumcised, don't do the Jewish rituals. It's terrible, terrible thing, and put your soul in danger of eternal damnation if you do. And then he goes in the Book of Acts, and when he goes among the Jews, he goes and he participates there in Jerusalem. Now you say, well, why is he doing that? It's because he's not going to teach the Gentile Christians to follow the dying rituals of the Jews. But there's no absolute prohibition of the Jews who are faithful to keep doing them for a time, because we're in that period of transition. There's not just an off switch that happened at one moment with Christ's death, resurrection, ascension. So now we get evidence of that in Hebrews 8:13. In that he saith, a new covenant, he hath made the first old, meaning obsolete. So the old covenant, old rituals, and all that gone. New ones here. But then we get the evidence, of the gradual transition. Now that which decayeth and waxeth old is ready to vanish away. That's Hebrews, written to Hebrews, that was written in the 60s. So as they're approaching the year AD 70, he can still say, yep, we got the new covenant. The old one's already old, gone, obsolete. But we're in the period of transition, so it's really just decaying and waxing old. We're going to let it die out gradually, and it's ready to vanish away. It's going to be totally gone here soon. When? That happened in AD 70, when the temple was destroyed. After that period of time, you no longer had any evidence of patience with and acceptable toleration of the old Jewish worship. Christ is our sacrifice. Christ is our high priest. Christ is our all in all there, and we no longer need animal sacrifice as a temple. We no longer need the Levitical priesthood and the Jewish holidays and so on. All right, so we're going to keep going. That is from Christ to the destruction of the temple. We see the old stuff waxing away and dying off in that period. Then, after this, we're going to get this, the church bringing forth Christ. Okay, now this is a period of time where the church is going to go from being born as a church to actually becoming a church that has a mature understanding of Christ and what it is to believe in Christ, who Christ is, his person and natures. He's a divine person, two distinct natures, human and divine. Okay, and I'll look at that in just a second, because we're going to go through the ecumenical councils, and there's a lot to learn here. I'm not going to dig into the details, but we need to see how this works to understand when Christ was, quote unquote, born of the church. Okay. Now remember, this isn't like a terrible way to speak. We're not saying that Christ physically or in his divine nature came from the church. Nothing like that. This is what Paul was talking about here in Galatians 4:19. My little children, of whom I travail in birth, again until what? Christ be formed in you. Paul, an apostle, representing the church in his authoritative role, is bringing forth Christ where? In the people, who are the church, the faithful. When the faithful finally grasp, understand, love, imitate, and live the life of Christ, it's like the church brought forth Christ. And Jesus says more or less the same thing. His mother and brethren are out there calling for him, and he says, who is my mother or brethren? And he looked around and says, behold, my mother and my brethren. Who? For whosoever shall do the will of God, the same as my brother, my sister, my mother. So again, the church doing the will of God is like the mother of Christ, bringing forth Christ in it by doing the will of Christ, by living the life of Christ, by receiving the truths of Christ, and so on. All right. So when we see in Revelation 12 that the woman brings forth the man-child, okay, this is the church bringing forth Christ. And that's this period in the history of redemption in the early church when we have, overlapping with the old Roman Empire, with the crowns on the seven heads, the church bringing forth theologically Christ, especially in the ecumenical councils where they were clarifying who the church worships, who is Jesus Christ. Now, we're going to go ahead and look at these very quickly so you can see when these councils happened and what the understanding of Christ was quickly. So we had the first Council of Nicea, 325 is the year, rejects Arianism. Okay, so it's an affirmation of the true divinity of Christ and the rejection of the idea that Christ is maybe the firstborn of all creation, the greatest of all created beings, the most divine-like of non-divine beings, or something like that, right? But he's certainly not equal to the Father in his substance, power, nature. Okay, and that would be the Arian heresy. The Christian church affirms he is divine, the same substance as the Father. Okay, equal. Now, the Second Ecumenical Council was in 381. First Council of Constantinople. Again, a rejection of Arianism, Apollinarianism. This is, this idea that Jesus is fully divine and an almost complete human nature, but without a human mind, no rational mind. Instead, he has just had, it's like a body with God's mind in him. They reject that because for Jesus to be true man, he needs to have a true human mind and rational soul. And then you have Sabellianism or modalism, which is to say that each of the persons of the Trinity is just a mode in which God reveals himself, right? So sometimes God acts like the Father, other times he acts like the Son, he's in that mode, and other times like the Holy Spirit, but they're not three distinct persons simultaneously, eternally, right? So they rejected Sabellianism or modalism. So we're getting an idea that Christ is what? Christ is fully God. Christ is fully man. Christ isn't mostly man with a divine mind and soul without human soul or mind, right? We're getting that sort of a picture of Christ, and we're also finding out that Christ is a distinct person from the Father and the Son, not just a mode of God's existence. Okay, Council of Ephesus in 431. Now we get the rejection of Nestorianism and the acceptance of Theotokos or whatever. So this is the idea of Mary as the mother of God. Now that's to be understood very carefully. They had a very careful way of saying it, which is perfectly acceptable and orthodox. Mary never is the mother of the divine nature. She doesn't create God. That's not what the church was saying. The church was saying that the union of the human and divine nature are such that those things that you can say of the human nature can be spoken of in one respect in relation, predicate of the divine nature. For example, you could say, God died on the cross. Well, the divine nature of Jesus Christ did not die on the cross. But Jesus Christ is a divine person with a divine nature, and in his human nature, he died on the cross. So God died on the cross by way of the human nature, roughly, right? And so we can say that Mary is the mother of God because the union between the human and divine nature are like that. She brought forth a human, Jesus, who is in a hypostatic union with the divine nature. He is a divine person. He has a divine nature. He's God. She didn't give birth to God in the sense of create God, nothing like that. But what they were clarifying is that you have the one person, a divine person, in two distinct natures, joined in such a tight way that whatever is true of one nature can be said of the other. Okay. And so they rejected Nestorianism, which was the idea that it was like two persons really closely associated. You have the human person, Jesus, and then the divine second person, the Trinity, and they're in a really close union, but they're still two persons. They rejected that. No, one person. And that's why you have to be able to say that God is born of Mary, not the divine nature being born of Mary in the same way that the human nature is, but it's in virtue of the human nature being born of her that this person, who's a divine person, was born of Mary. So she's the mother of God. And that was a clarification there, rejecting Nestorianism. The Council of Chalcedon, this rejects Eutychianism and gets in a statement of Orthodox Christianity. Eutychianism was a heresy that said that the human nature sort of paled so much in comparison to the divine nature that you could almost just ignore it altogether. It's like one drop of water in an ocean, and the divine nature so overwhelmed, in a sense, the human nature that he's just a divine nature without a human nature, no true human nature there, something like that. Either way, the Eutychian heresy was rejected because they wanted to affirm very clearly that real, complete, full human nature. And then you get the statement of Orthodox Christianity, Christology, in the Chalcedonian definition. Okay, so I'll read this quickly. We then, following the Holy Fathers, all with one consent, teach people to confess one and the same Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, the same perfect in Godhead and also perfect in manhood, truly God and truly man, of a reasonable soul and body. See, so we're getting truly God and truly man of a reasonable soul and body. There's the human nature. So he gets a real soul with a rational mind, okay, human mind. That's the rejection of the Apollinarianism. And body, consubstantial with the Father, same substance with the Father, so we're getting the same divinity, according to the Godhead, so true human, truly divine, and consubstantial with us according to the manhood, true human, just like us. In all things like unto us, except without sin. Begotten before all ages of the Father, according to the Godhead, so he's eternally God, not a creation, and eternally begotten. And in these latter days, for us and for our salvation, born of the Virgin Mary. Notice, we're going to get the Mother of God here. That's from the previous council. And so, but they made it, in that context, they were very explicit that Mary is bringing forth Jesus according to the manhood. See, it says that, for us and for our salvation, born of the Virgin Mary, the Mother of God, according to the manhood. One and the same Christ, Son, Lord, only begotten, to be acknowledged in two natures, inconfusedly, so without any confusion, unchangeably, so it's an immutable thing, indivisibly, you can't separate the two natures, they are joined as one person, inseparably. Okay? The distinction of natures being by no means taken away by the union, so they're joined in a union as one person, but the distinction is truly a distinction. It's not like Eutychians where they say the human nature sort of gets absorbed or mixed up with the divine nature, but rather the property of each nature being preserved and concurring in one person and one substance, or one hypostasis, not parted or divided into two persons, but one and the same Son and only begotten, the Word. So this is now the divine. Okay, the Lord Jesus Christ, as the prophets from the beginning have declared concerning him, and the Lord Jesus Christ himself has taught us, and the creed of the Holy Fathers has handed down to us. So here you get your statement of Orthodox Christology, but it's not totally settled. I mean, this is settled, but there's going to be continued debate after this, and then we're going to get additional councils. So the Second Council of Constantinople, again, rejects Nestorianism, two persons, each nature is its own person, human person and the divine person. That's not the right understanding of it. So Nestorianism was rejected. And again, and in this case, Monophysitism, or the Monophysite heresy, which is one nature. So any statement that there's only one nature of Christ. So they reject the two natures being divided so much that there's two persons, and they reject the idea that the two natures should be combined so much that there's only one nature, monophysitism. So only one nature. And then we have the Third Council of Constantinople, which is the rejection of monothelitism, or the monothelite heresy. Just like thelema is about the will, do as thou wilt, it's a satanic religion. That's from the Greek word that refers to will, thelema, and here's the monothel. And the question was at this time, so to make it one person, you have the two natures, separate natures, human and divine. Do they have only one will, or is there a divine will and a human will? And they rejected the one will theory. They said, no, he has a human will and he has a divine will. So again, they're emphasizing the completeness of each nature in the one person of Christ. Now things get really interesting. We've got our 6 councils. We're at the year 680 to 81, and there's another one. But this gets contentious because the Catholic Church and most of these churches say that the 7th Ecumenical Council was in the year 687, the Second Council of Nicea, very famous. But that wasn't the first council that claimed to be the 7th Ecumenical Council. The Council of Hieria in 754 claimed to be an ecumenical council, and it condemned the use of icons or images of Christ. Okay, it said, nope, there are no icons acceptable. Okay, you cannot make images of Christ. Okay, and it was explaining this and defending this position as an application of what has been concluded in the previous 6 ecumenical councils. Let's look at this. So here's from this council, the Iconoclastic Council in 754. And the council says this, and it did claim, here, the definition of the Holy, Great, and Ecumenical Seventh Synod. That's how it began. They claimed to be an ecumenical council. Okay, and it said, Satan misguided men so that they worshipped the creature instead of the creator. I'm going to skip ahead here. The ornament of the church and the Holy Fathers and the 6 ecumenical councils, see how they're appealing to the 6 ecumenical councils about Christ, have preserved inviolate. But the aforementioned, demiurgos of wickedness, or I guess urge of wickedness in some sense, could not endure the sight of this adornment and gradually brought back idolatry under the appearance of Christianity. After we had carefully examined their decrees under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, we found that the unlawful art of painting living creatures blasphemed the fundamental doctrine of our salvation, what? Namely, the incarnation of Christ, and contradicted the 6 holy synods. These condemned Nestorius because he divided the one Son and the Word of God into 2 sons, and on the other side, Arius, Dioscorus, Eutyches, and Severus, because they maintained a mingling of the 2 natures of the one Christ. So here, you see they're going back to this clarification between, nope, you can't have 2 persons, and nor do you only have 1 nature. You've got 1 person with 2 natures. And they are going to claim that making images of Christ and using them in worship is a violation of these orthodox teachings of Christology. Okay, and they go on, they explain it. Wherefore we thought it right to show forth with all accuracy in our present definition the error of such that make and venerate these images. For it is the unanimous doctrine of all the Holy Fathers and of the 6 ecumenical councils that no one may imagine any kind of separation or mingling in opposition to the unsearchable, unspeakable, and incomprehensible union of the 2 natures in the one hypostasis or person of Christ. What avails, then, the folly of the painter, who, from sinful love of gain, depicts that which should not be depicted? That is, with his polluted hands, he tries to fashion that which should only be believed in the heart and confessed with the mouth. He makes an image and calls it Christ. The name Christ signifies God and man. Consequently, it is an image of God and man, and consequently, he has in his foolish mind, in his representation of the created flesh, depicted the Godhead, which cannot be represented, and thus mingled what should not be mingled. Thus, he is guilty of a double blasphemy, the one in making an image of the Godhead, and the other by mingling the Godhead and the manhood. So, he's denying the when he mingles the Godhead and the manhood, he's denying Orthodox Christology, which doesn't mingle. That was in the Chalcedonian Creed. Those fall into the same blasphemy who venerate the image, and the same woe rests upon both, because they are with Arius, Dioscorus, and Eutyches, and with the heresy of Acephaly, I don't know. When, however, they are blamed for undertaking to depict the divine nature of Christ. Okay, you can read this. The point is, they're going to go and they're laying this out in the creed, in this council, that these images of Christ, when you make them, you're going to be either guilty of Nestorianism or Eutychianism. You're going to confuse the natures, or you're going to separate the natures, right? In any way. So, for example, if you say, no, I'm not making an image of God. Oh, so you're saying that Christ can be depicted, but he's not divine. Right. Oh, so you're saying you have 2 persons. That's Nestorianism. Well, no, I don't want that. Right? And so they're going to go back and forth. They're going to get trapped. they're in a dilemma. If you're going to make images of Christ, you have to try to make an image of God, and that's prohibited in the Ten Commandments, the second commandment. Okay, and so it would be a violation of the law of God to make images of Christ. You just can't pull it off. And you can't say, yeah, but he's a man, so we're able to make images of his manhood. No, you can't make an image of Christ's manhood without making an image or trying to make an image of God, because the manhood of Christ is united to the divinity of Christ in a hypostatic union that cannot be separated. You can't separate the two. And so you end up in this problem, and that's what the Seventh Ecumenical Council was saying. It condemned the use of images and says that anytime you bring these back in, you're bringing idolatry back into the church under the appearance of Christianity. When churches have their pictures of Jesus up, or artists make drawings of Jesus, or paintings of Jesus, or statues of Jesus, or crucifixes with Jesus on them, or whatever, that would be prohibited by Orthodox Christianity and Scripture's teaching against idolatry. And so that was the Seventh Ecumenical Council in the year 754, not the Second Council of Nicea, the Second Council of Nicea, which was in 787. What did that council do? It condemned iconoclasm and said you are allowed to make images of Christ and venerate them. That could be argued to be a bringing in of the abomination which causes desolation, right? Just like you had with Antiochus Epiphanes when he brought in an idol onto the altar, right? That is an abomination to bring idols into the worship of God. So that's what came in after this, and they rejected the Council of Hieria as not valid. Why? Because the Pope wasn't there, and a couple of the main heretical bishops that ended up taking over the church in a lot of ways, right? So they were already being rejected by the church at that point. Then they come out and say, no, we're not going to allow that. We're just going to say your council doesn't count. We're going to make up our own, bring our idols in, and that's the real Christianity. And then the church had to live with these idolaters ruling the church for centuries. Now, what you have here then is 754 is the Seventh Ecumenical Council. That's when you have Christ, quote unquote, born. And it's after that the church takes a strong turn the other way and rejects Orthodox Christianity and is immediately attacking Christ to destroy it, destroy what's been brought forth. He brings forth Christ, and then they're going to set up their idols in the church and just try to destroy it. Now, here's what's very interesting. Where's our history? We have up to 754, the woman bringing forth Christ, and then after that, we're supposed to get a 1260-year period. Now, this 1260-year period is the period of apostasy that comes after. Remember, it says, right after she's supposed to flee to the wilderness when the serpent goes after the man-child. She brought forth Christ immediately after he's born. So right after this, we're going to get that 1260-year period. When does that 1260-year period happen? Remember the little horn that comes up? And the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise, and another shall rise after them, and he shall be diverse from the first, and he shall subdue 3 kings, and he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws, and they shall be given into his hands, the 1260 years, the time and times and dividing of the time, right? So here you have it. It happens when? When the little horn shows up out of the back of the fallen Roman Empire and plucks up 3 other horns and then goes to be the blasphemer that persecutes. Who's that? That is the Roman Catholic Church. The Pope rising up in the year roughly between 756 and 800. I'll show you. Okay. So that list of traits that we just read in Daniel about that little horn, the Pope satisfies them. You can pause that and read that. I won't go on forever talking if I read all that right now. Okay. But he is a ruler of a temporal kingdom. He heads the Papal States, now even to this day, the Vatican City. It is the ruler of a kingdom that arises after the 10 horns arise. So he showed up after other kingdoms came out of the fallen Roman Empire. That's true. Compared to the rulers of the other 10 kingdoms, this ruler is very unique. Well, he's both a religious leader and the head of the Catholic Church, and also a political ruler, a king. So that makes him very unique. We'll talk about this one in a second. In the acquisition of its temporal kingdom, this ruler subdues 3 of the 10 kingdoms. This ruler speaks great words against God, Vicar of Christ, the universal bishop, and all sorts of things, and also speak great words against God in his various idolatries he supports and so on. This ruler is responsible for the persecution of the saints. Long history of that in the Catholic Church. This ruler changes times and laws. He creates all sorts of holy festivals and his church calendar and so on. This ruler governs for a time, times, and the dividing of a time, the 1,260 years. So now let's look at this. The one that's most interesting is he comes up how? Plucking up 3 other kingdoms. In the year 756, the Pope, who was ruling the Duchy of Rome, was given, after a war that happened between Pepin and the Lombards, the Exarchate of Ravenna, the Duchy of the Pentapolis, and the Duchy of Perugia, and these became the Papal States right here, right across Italy. And so the little horn comes up and gets 3 horns. That was in the year 756. Okay, you can read this. What you're reading here actually comes from a book I published in 2011. But I don't tell people the name of the book anymore because I want to do an updated edition, and the place where it's in print is I have no way to access any of the money. So if anybody buys it, I don't get a dime from it, not literally a cent. And so I guess if you wanted the PDF, I could probably come up with an edited version someday and share that with you. All right, you can read a little more there. Okay, so in 756, we get the beginning. Notice the Seventh Ecumenical Council, the truly Orthodox Seventh Ecumenical Council that opposed the use of these images, was in 754. That's when the man-child's brought forth. And in 756, the 3 horns are plucked up, marking the beginning of this period. Now, there's some question about whether it was exactly in 756. That would be what I think the 3 horns are, these here. Some people may have the Exarchate of Ravenna, including the Duchy of Pentapolis or something, so that there's only 2, and you're going to get a 3rd horn a few years later or whatever. But you have other years in this period of time. 774, the last Lombard king was conquered. 781, Charlemagne codifies, regions over which the Pope would be the temporal king. So maybe it's the time of this codification of the rule. 787, that's the perhaps the icons being the abomination which causes desolation. 800, Charlemagne crowned by Pope as Pope by the Pope as the Holy Roman Emperor. But this period, this window, is clearly where the little horn becomes the little horn with his 3 horns plucked up. It's going to be between the years 756 and 800 at the very latest. And so our 1260 years begins in roughly 756 to 800 and would end this century, 2016 to 2060. So it'd be sometime after 2016 and as late as just after 2060s, I guess, in the 2060s, that you would have the 3.5 years of the 2 witnesses being killed off. They're prophesying for these 1260 years, and then after this, they get killed off. And so your 7-year period, if you have that with a 3.5-year persecution at the end, extreme tribulation, would come after the year 2016 up to a period just after 2060. So the fact that starting in 2017 to 2024 would be a 7-year period with a 3.5-year period kill-off coming right after 2016, some people would think would be a pretty clear line up perfectly, right? Line up really well. But we'll see. It may not happen exactly like that. We're going to have to watch and see how things unfold. And we have this window. So really, any time between 2016 and I say 2070, you could have this happening. I think it looks like it's ongoing. All right, so let's keep going. So now we've got our apostasy. Then we come after it. We get, just as an observation, as soon and his tail drew the serpent, the dragon, and his tail drew the third part of the stars of heaven and did cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born. So, child born, immediately horns being plucked up. Okay. Then we have the 3.5 year of the witnesses being silenced. That comes after the end of this 1260 year period. So sometime in this century, 2000, between 2016 and 70, like I just said. So there we're following our history of redemption. Explicitly, it says you got 1,260 years here. In Revelation of the two witnesses testifying, and then you have after that, when they've completed their testimony, 3.5 days dead. So sometime shortly after the 1,260 years is completed, you get them killed off. Now, you might get this to be a 7-year period by looking at the 70 weeks. The 70th week we have not really talked about. After the 69 weeks, when Christ arrives, of course, midway through, 3.5 years later, that's when he was crucified. That crucifixion and resurrection and everything that came with that brought about major changes in history, and almost everything important in the history of redemption that's been accomplished has been accomplished on account of the virtue of this act of Christ, this redemptive act of Christ. And so the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, for example, is pointed to in this 7-year period. All right, now do I want to get into this? This is in this video. I guess I should just do it. This is a long video, but it is what it is. Hopefully you're still watching. You can pause if you need to. Come back. I have chapters on all videos, so you can also find the chapter you want to go to. So we have then the Messiah being cut off halfway through, but then on virtue of that, you also get this end of the sacrifice and oblation when the temple is destroyed, right? So you have here, let me just read this. And after 62 weeks shall the Messiah be cut off. So you get this, and then afterwards you're going to get a crucifixion of the Messiah, but not for himself. And the people of the prince shall come. The prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. So here you have the Roman emperor coming and destroying Jerusalem, AD 70, and the temple. And the end thereof shall be with a flood, metaphorical, the military coming and all that. And under the end of the war, desolations are determined. So we have the destruction of Jerusalem here in AD 70. Now, that also would have a dual application, I believe, according to Christ, and to the end of the era. Okay, so when we get to this final period in history after the 1260 years, you're going to have again this sort of being fulfilled. But in that time, the destruction of the sacrifice and oblation, whoever it is going to cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease. That's the destruction of the two witnesses. Not the physical temple in this case, but the worship of the faithful, which are going to be silenced for 3.5 years. That's the ceasing of the sacrifice and the oblation. Because in the New Covenant era, what is sacrifice and oblation? It is not physical sacrificing of animals at a temple. It's the spiritual worship. We get evidence of that in, look, there's two places. First, do I have Isaiah? I surely have Isaiah. Here, Isaiah 19. So we're talking about the millennium here, and Egypt, and actually worshiping God, being delivered after some difficult times. And the Lord shall be known in Egypt, and the Egyptians shall know the Lord in that day. That wasn't the ancient world. This is in the New Covenant period, the church, and looking forward to the millennium. And shall do sacrifice and oblation. Not physical. This is the Christian era. They don't do that anymore. Christ is our sacrifice. So this is a representation of their spiritual worship. Okay. So I think when we're looking at the sacrifice and oblation here, in verse 27, I think it's looking at Christian worship, and that's the two witnesses being killed off. Okay, that's the end of sacrifice and oblation. Literally killed off or just silenced for that period. You have a ceasing of their testimony, because that's what witnesses do. They testify. And when they're no longer capable of testifying, their churches are closed, shut down, the worship is silenced, and there's a persecution ongoing or coming soon, that sort of thing. That would be the ceasing of the sacrifice and oblation by the Antichrist. Okay. Now, why do I think that we have an application both to the destruction of the temple in AD 70 and to the end in Matthew 24? When the apostles ask their question, they conflate the destruction of the temple with the end of the world. So here, let's read this. And Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down of the temple. And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? Notice, when shall these things be? The temple be thrown down. And what shall be the sign of thy coming and the end of the world? See, they're conflating the two. It's like the temple's coming down at the end of the world. And then Jesus goes into this discussion. Okay? And he's going to answer it in a way where I think the destruction of the temple in AD 70 is sort of a type of a final fulfillment at the end of the age. Okay? And so he moves from talking primarily about the destruction of the temple to looking forward to things that will happen at the end. That is at least how I understand it. And so I think in Daniel, he also refers to the abomination which causes desolation, which is here referred to in Daniel. I think then Daniel's looking ahead to the destruction of the temple, and then having a further eye to the spiritual temple, the church, the two witnesses being persecuted at the end. I think we have these both in mind here in Daniel as well, which would give us a reason to think that possibly Daniel is suggesting a 7-year tribulation at the end. Okay. Now I'm going to just make a quick comment about this abomination which causes desolation. When you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Let them which be in Judea flee to the mountains. So the primary reference here is to the Roman army coming. When you see that coming, the abomination which causes desolation, flee, get out of there. So first, we do have a command in Scripture to flee. I've heard some people come and say, Christians aren't told to flee. Jesus never tells us to flee. We're supposed to fight back, stand strong, whatever. There are times when you're supposed to flee, and here's one of them. When the abomination of desolation shows up, get out, flee. That's what you're supposed to do. And here, the context is speaking primarily of the Roman armies. We get that clarified for us in Luke. Do I have Luke saved here? It does not look like I have Luke saved here. Nope, no Luke. But look it up yourself. Luke explicitly makes an application to armies. Now, but that doesn't necessarily mean that looking forward to the end, there isn't some other application of the abomination of desolation, perhaps even now in our own time or coming soon. And I don't know that we're going to have 100% certainty of what it is when we see it coming. I think we're going to have to pray a lot, watch, be careful, look at the times we're in, and do the best we can. But abominations are generally something contrary to nature or just utterly detestable when they're understood. And frankly, I think the current injection is a clear abomination. And if any of the therapy here, if what we've heard from scientists, doctors who are warning people about the dangers of it is true, and it's even a fraction as bad as what some of them are saying, it is a desolating abomination, something that goes into the body, makes the body do something it is not designed by God to do, creating proteins that are not natural for the body to create, and they are harmful, desolating proteins. That to me looks like an abomination which causes desolation. I'm not saying it is the abomination which causes desolation here, but if we're in the timeline, if we're in that window of the end, if we are looking at a looking for something that will desolate the world and destroy many and take them out, brought by the new, in a sense, the new power of in the U.S. So when I'm talking about the new power, it's like the Roman army. The army comes, and that's the abomination which causes desolation. The army represented by eagles and often referred to in that way. If you have the U.S. being that in the modern period, perhaps bringing forth its abomination which causes desolation, something that goes into the body and makes an abomination of us and kills us. That, to me, is possible. That's a candidate for this in the end times. I'm making that comment as an observation. I think, to my mind, we're getting close to the point where it may be prudent to take this flea counsel somewhat literally for us in our generation. I'm not sure. I can't counsel anybody on anything like that, but I can just say it's a possible, to me, it's a possibly plausible interpretation. It's a plausible interpretation. So anyways, let's keep going. So you might get a 7-week period or 7-year period at the end. So we can bump this 3.5 years out and maybe get 7 years in here. Okay. So you might get, for example, if the 1,260-year period ends in 2016, and then your 7-year period from 2016 to 2023 or 2017 to 2024, you get your 3.5 years, the second half of it. That would actually line up pretty well. Makes sense. If it's not 2016 and maybe 2000, any of those other years we've talked about, any time between 2016 and 2070, you can have this. Roughly 2070. Could be even a little later, I guess. I'll explain that in a second. All right. Now, if we're trying to fill out this history of redemption even better, we do have in Daniel 1,290 days and 1,335 days. Okay, so that 1,260 years seems to be bumped ahead another 30, then 45 years, up to 75 years after. Could be days, if it's just the second half here, but looks like it's years. I suspect that what we're looking at is you have a 1,260-year period of apostasy, then you're going to have a 30-year period of transition, probably including the 7-year period at some point, and then after that, a further 45-year period of time sort of to rebuild for the millennium. And so when you read this, we have this. I'll read it. Then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, there stood other two, the one on this side of the bank of the river and the other on that side of the bank of the river. And one said to the man clothed in linen, which was upon the waters of the river, how long shall it be to the end of these wonders? And I heard the man clothed in linen, which was upon the waters of the river, when he held up his right hand and his left hand unto heaven, and swear by him that liveth forever and ever, that it shall be for a time, times and a half. There's your 1,260 years. And when he shall have accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people, all these things shall be finished. And I heard, but I understood not. Then said I, O my Lord, what shall be the end of these things? And he said, go thy way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed till the end of the time, till the time of the end. Many shall be purified and made white and tried. But the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand. And from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Now we get an extra 30 in there. Blessed is he that waiteth, and cometh to the 1,335 days. See how it's progressively extended out until you get full blessing after the 1,335 years. So I think what you're getting is a period of transition. You get your 12 or 60 years, starting with the, basically the real Christians being sort of bumped out of the church and rejected by the popes and the papal antichrist. When he rises to power, then he sets up the abomination, which causes desolation, bringing the idols back into the church, rejecting basically orthodox Christology and understanding of Christ that was developed when the church was bringing forth Christ. He sets himself up, does that, and then you have a 1,260-year period, after which you get this persecution, a 30-year period of transition, then finally another 45 years passes of rebuilding or something like that, and you have, blessed is that guy who got there, because you end up there, you're in the millennium. Okay, so that's the history of redemption, as I understand it. There's sort of the picture of it. You get your millennium here. Okay, now what I want to focus on here is how this looks a lot like the life of Christ, right? What do we have? Church brings forth Christ, so Christ matures here. Then Christ gets his ministry, has his ministry being rejected, right? Even in Christ's ministry, what happens? Because people wouldn't respect his command to not tell everybody, he ends up getting driven out of the cities and having to, carry out much of his ministry in the quote unquote the wilderness, out in the deserts and outside the cities. Why? Because it wasn't safe for him to be in the cities. He's been forced to flee, like the church is forced to flee. Okay? And so he's out there doing his ministry and being a witness, but has to do it sort of from outside the populated areas for most of his ministry. Now he's out there. There's your, for how long? 3.5 years in his ministry. Here is your 1,260 year period. That's his 3.5 years of ministry like that. At the end of that, what happens to Christ? You have a Passion Week, and he's killed. And for 3 days and 3 nights, he's dead before he rises again. There is your 3.5 years of 3.5 days of the 2 witnesses being killed off. So that's at the end. So you get his ministry, and then you get the death of the church, just like the death of Christ. After which, what happens to the church and the 2 witnesses? They rise from the dead, just like Christ rose from the dead. And then what happens to them? They ascend into heaven, just like Christ ascended into heaven. What you are saying is that the Christian church is called upon to live the life of Christ corporately and participate in the life, suffering, and glory of Christ at the end. But this, again, is a big problem for the view of a rapture. We're not getting zipped out of here before the dying. That'd be like if Christ was getting close to the final crucifixion and he prayed at Gethsemane, take this cup from me, and God zapped him up into heaven and said, great, okay, you're free from suffering here. You don't have to go to the part that's the most important. If we're raptured out before that 3.5 year persecution or silencing of the church and tribulation, well, I mean, that goes against the entire spirit of the church participating in the life of Christ. Okay, so that is the parallel. And so the history of redemption is one where the church brings forth Christ, rejection of icons and idols and images of Christ, and the use and veneration of images and worship was sort of the culmination of Christology. We got it. When we got to the point where we realized you cannot make images of Christ and use them in church because it would destroy the nature, the relation with the person and the natures of Christ and their understanding, the proper understanding of the union there, the hypostatic union. When you get that, you finally have a mature understanding of Christianity and of Christ. And it's immediately then that Satan says, we got to destroy this, and the beast rises up to attack and immediately goes to work getting rid of that view and that council, which is very important, against images, and reestablishes the use of images as setting up idolatry in the church as the norm. And then you have a period of apostasy with terrible churches, by and large, and only a few witnesses, faithful witnesses, a remnant that's faithful until you get to the end of it, which leads into a period of extreme difficulty, persecution, and about a 75-year period of change to the millennium. And then you have a millennium. All right, that's what I have. Like, subscribe, share, and take care. Blessings.